In the last video, I started C.S. Lewis's Miracles, Chapter 1. We talked about ghosts. Let's finish up the first chapter.
Or come first. Here is an example of the sort of thing that happens if we omit the preliminary philosophical task and rush on to the historical. In a popular commentary on the Bible, you will find a discussion of the date at which the fourth Gospel was written. The author says it must have been written after the execution of St. Peter, because in the fourth Gospel, Christ is represented as predicting the execution of St. Peter. A book, thinks the author, cannot be written before events which it refers to. Of course it cannot, unless real predictions ever occur. If they do, then this argument for the date is in ruins. And the author has not discussed at all whether real predictions are possible. He takes it for granted, perhaps unconsciously, that they are not. Perhaps he is right. But if he is, he has not discovered this principle by historical inquiry. He has brought his disbelief in predictions to his historical work, so to speak, ready-made. Unless he had done so, his historical conclusion about the date of the fourth Gospel could not have been reached at all. His work is therefore quite useless to a person who wants to know whether predictions occur. The author gets to work only after he has already answered that question in the negative, and on grounds which he never communicates to us. This book is intended as a preliminary to historical inquiry. I am not a trained historian, and I shall not examine the historical evidence for the Christian miracles. My effort is to put my readers in a position to do so. It is no use going to the texts until we have some idea about the possibility or probability of the miraculous. Those who assume that miracles cannot happen are merely wasting their time by looking into the texts. We know in advance what results they will find, for they have begun by begging the question.
So Lewis makes the point, which is a good point, that let's say one of these commentaries, and I'm sure there's plenty of them that do as Lewis describes here, make the point that, well, we know the Gospel of John must be written after the death of Peter, because in the last chapter of the Gospel of John, Peter gives an indication at the means by which Peter will die. Now, Lewis's point is that author has assumed something. And I think we might pause and say, well, why has that author assumed something? Well, the author has assumed that, of course, there cannot be prediction. And Lewis makes the point that the author hasn't engaged with this at all. Now, I'd like to take another step back and say, why has the author assumed that there can't be prediction before time? That gets into a lot of interesting questions. I paused the recording because I thought of an illustration that I thought would probably be served by some illustrations. This question of prediction seems simple on the outset, but it's not simple. And I think, again, this is an area where the Peterson conversation makes sense. Now, very famous incident, John Brown. He was an abolitionist, and he was a wild man. I'm just pulling up a biography about him. John Brown, radical abolitionist, Kansas, bloody Kansas, born in Connecticut. Devout family, very much a believer, very much a theist, very much a God who intervenes, married twice, fathered 20 children. The expanded family moved with Brown through travels, residing in Ohio, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York. Failed at several business ventures before declaring bankruptcy. At age 55, Brown moved with his sons to the Kansas Territory. In response to the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas, John Brown led a small band of men to Pottawatomie Creek in May 24, 1856. The men dragged 5 unarmed men and boys believed to be slavery proponents from their homes and brutally murdered them. Afterwards, Brown raided Missouri, freeing 11 slaves and killing the slave owners. Following the events, Brown spent 2.5 years traveling through New England, raising money to bring his anti-slavery war to the South. In 1959, John Brown, under the alias Isaac Smith, rented the Kennedy farmhouse 4 miles north of Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. At the farm, Brown trained his 21-man army and planned their capture of the Federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Part of the plan included providing slaves in the area with weapons of pikes and rifles. Brown believed that these armed men would then join his army and free more slaves as they fanned southward through the Appalachian Mountains. If the plan worked, it would strike terror in the hearts of slave owners. On October 18, 1859, John Brown and his men raided the federal arsenal. Unfortunately for Brown, nothing went as planned. Slaves living in the area did not join the raid. Local militia and the United States Marines, under none other than Robert E. Lee, put down the raid, and most of Brown's men were either killed or captured, including 2 of his sons. Ironically, the first man killed during the raid was Hayward Shepard, a free black man working with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Despite being severely wounded, Brown was quickly tried and found guilty of murder, inciting slave insurrection, and treason against the state of Virginia. Upon hearing his sentence, Brown said, "If it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions of this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wickedness, cruelty, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done." Brown was quite a man, and a lot of people are going to think a lot of things of Brown. Was he a hero? Was he a fool? Was he a terrorist? Who was John Brown? Brown told the court he had hoped to carry out his plans without the snapping of a gun on either side. But Brown's vision of ending slavery was marred by the death of innocent civilians, both in Kansas and at Harper's Ferry. The nation was divided over his actions. Many abolitionists called him a hero. Slaveholders called him a base villain. Today he would have been called a terrorist. People on both sides of the fence denounced Brown's use of violence. Brown was hanged December 2, 1859. Before he died, Brown issued a final and seemingly prophetic word on a note he handed to his jailer. My computer isn't working right. "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. Within 1 year, the first Southern state would secede from the Union." Okay, here's the question. What kind of prophecy can we think about with respect to John Brown? Now, prophecy is basically you predict X and then event X happens at some point in the future. And what C.S. Lewis is talking about here is, we assume, although C.S. Lewis isn't talking about this directly, a relationship with what we call revelation. That God foreknew event X and therefore communicated said event to the prophet or someone in advance. Now, there are plenty of instances in the Old Testament where a prophet will say, "Thus saith the Lord," and in a past video I talked about the prophet test of Deuteronomy 18. But this business of prophecy gets complicated in a secular age, because what happens in a secular age is we draw a box around ourselves, and this box is secularity. Now, sometimes this box, as materialists say, things cannot happen, and they, in a sense, claim that this box is all there is, and that would, in a sense, be by definition, a materialist. Or some materialists, especially modernists, it was interesting again in the Rubin report that had Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson. Ben Shapiro said, well, there's the public-private thing. So then what happens here is that people will say that, well, the box of secularity defines not reality, but what is permissible in terms of public and private space. Therefore, if such a thing exists of revelation, it has to stay out of the public realm and it must stay in a private realm. All that we can talk about in the public space is that which can be demonstrated in a public space, and that's where we tend to get down to science. And I mentioned in my last video, in terms of our system, we kind of have a two-stage system where we say, well, it has to be It has to be public, such as something material or scientific. Now, when you get into the area of social sciences, that gets a little increasingly muddied. Or it has to be decided democratically. For example, if we decide that the age of consent for sexual activity is 18, you have what's called statutory rape. And so then the group of people, the consensus of the governed, determines morality. But we're not going to bring God or holy books or anything like that into it, although it's hard to argue that the history of religion creates consensus among the people, and thereby legislatures legislate according to moral beliefs that have been founded by religious ideas. And this gets into some of the conversation that Peterson is looking at. But now back to prediction. What happens if there's human forecasting? In other words, if you think about it, you didn't have to be that smart to understand that the United States was heading towards cataclysm in the form of the Civil War. So, well, how do we regard John Brown's prophecy? Was it divine revelation? Was it just a smart guy looking forward? In one of my previous videos, I talked about predicting the election of U.S. presidents. Now, we're always getting into probability and reason and luck in terms of human forecasting. We do so with weather models, and none of us are claiming that this is revelation. So when in the Bible we read that Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple, Jesus prophesied the death of Peter. Well, what kind of prophecy is that? Is that human prophecy? Is that divine prophecy? And in many ways, people will look at this and say, well, maybe it was human. Now, what gets funny with Jordan Peterson is with his agnosticism. He says, as in the H3 video, that philosophical insights separated. Well, I leave that door open. That's quite a door you leave open, because what in a sense does is God then becomes a fuzzy picture. And if you, as I think Peterson is arguing, not fully arguing, he's leaving the door open. I mean, God as an idea, God as, so I think Jung believed in more of a spiritual world than Peterson does. But Jung's spiritual world, I don't know. I have my doubts that Jung's spiritual world was in alignment with, let's say, traditional Christianity, if we can talk about that as one thing. And at some point, when I do a video on Jordan Peterson's God, when I feel sufficiently ready to tackle that subject, one of the arguments I'm going to make is that when we talk about traditional Christianity, there are a lot of cultural manifestations of that. And similar to my argument on Sola Scriptura, which I made in the Rough Draft to Sunday video a while, Christians answer these questions in detail in some different ways. Now, is that okay? I think it's okay, because Christians can't help but answer these questions from a human framework. Am I undercutting perspicuity of Scripture and the authority of Scripture with that? I don't believe so. However clear and inspired Scripture is, my ability to interpret it in this age is always liable to my insufficiencies. What does that mean? Well, that means that even if you decide on mechanical inspiration, even if you use all these separate mechanisms to try to keep your book as holy as possible, even if you demand that you must only read the holy book in its original language. There's an element which is me, which will always get things wrong, which again for me leads me back to my Calvinism, and some have been asking about my Calvinism, and why I'm a Calvinist is because I think we are not finally saved by our knowledge. We are not finally saved by our actions. Well, what do I mean by saved? Well, watch all my past videos. I have a very broad sense of the term saved. We existentially, we are not finally delivered into, what word shall I use? I don't want to use heaven, because into the full realization of what we were meant to be, which is, I think, our resurrected selves. We don't finally get there by ourselves through our efforts, but this is in fact grace. And grace, by grace we are justified, by grace we are sanctified, by grace we are perfected. And no matter how hard I work at biblical interpretation, I am always set within my framework. So when people say, well, is Jordan Peterson saved? And they use an evangelical language for that, I'd say, first of all, you can't know that because God does the saving and you don't know past and future. Second of all, and this is where my Calvinism shows, that's not even finally up to Jordan Peterson. And so when we get into conversations of evaluating Jordan Peterson's 12 steps, is this a self-help book? Is this a sufficient witness to Christianity? I would say no. Look at the Magi comment I made in the previous video. I think Peterson is pointing to a lot of wisdom that has its roots in Christianity. People would be well served in taking a lot of his good advice, but Christianity is finally a story of an intervening God who makes nature. And this is where we're going to go in C.S. Lewis's book on miracles. And so I'm going to end chapter 1 here, and to give you a little taste of what's coming in chapter 2, we're going to get into the question of nature and supernature. And we have to face the fact that nature and supernature is a relatively new category. The ancients didn't have this category. And so, for example, if you read John Walton, he'll note that in the ancient worlds, the gods were very much in the world, and in some ways, the gods are very much of the world. And it's for this reason that eventually in Lewis's book, we're going to have to get into pantheism. And we're going to talk a lot about pantheism because Lewis makes the assertion, which I think is a tremendously brilliant assertion, that pantheism is probably the natural religion of humanity apart from revelation. So, the Hebrews, however, take this move, and this is where Jordan Peterson's lectures become interesting. Jordan Peterson, in a sense, cracks the iron box of secularism and opens the door. And he's an agnostic, so he says, I'm leaving the door open. And I can see why Brett Weinstein and Sam Harris are very nervous about this door left open, because they're going to say a lot of stuff comes through that door. Think about the Avengers. You open this portal to heaven. A lot of stuff comes through that door. Well, can you trust what might come through that door? And this gets into the question of the iron box of secularism, that I think we line it with iron from the inside because we very much want to keep God out. Now, if Jordan Peterson is suspicious of the motivations of people who are promoting who are promoting legislative language and legislative speech for whatever motivations they have, of course, Jordan Peterson is concerned about postmodern neo-Marxism. What are the motivations for the iron box of secularism? Why do we very much want to keep God out? And I think it has a great deal to do with human dignity. I think it has a great deal to do with the Heidelberg Catechism begins by saying, I am not my own. I think contemporary American culture and Western culture doesn't have an open hand, but has a fist that says, I am my own. And to that, I don't think it's a terribly well-informed opinion, because who you are stands after this long process of history and biology and genetics and all of the ways that you are molded and shaped by everything that's going on in your life. So we're going to have to get into what is nature and what is supernature, and eventually this Hebrew God that in the beginning of the story starts the story unlike Marduk, that is in a sense looking to kill his mother after having already killed his father. And this God who in Genesis 1 tells this story where the universe is not filled with all of these other gods. Now that gets very complicated in the Old Testament, because some have said that the Hebrews were henotheists, and they make good arguments for that. Michael Heisner is the one making those videos. He also does some work with Logos, who does my Bible software. Some, I think, very learned and very good videos to watch. But so this Hebrew vision that comes through in Genesis 1 of the Lord who governs heaven and earth. Lewis will say he is an invader, and well, he is an invader from our perspective. He is the author and the rightful king and the husband. And again, if you watch some of my videos on Ezekiel, you'll see where I go with that. But the Greeks, it's interesting, because then when you look at Plato, the Greeks are always trying to figure this out, because okay, so there's my little cell phone holder. And there's the form of cell phone holders, or according to Aristotle, can I discern the essence of my cell phone holder with every instantiation of it? And in the H3 clip that Philosophical Insights made of Peterson, someone had commented once about his some of his Aristotelianism in him, and I could hear it in that video. So we got to suss this out, and Lewis, I think, is going to be very helpful in working that out. So there's a little teaser, and there's the conclusion to Miracles chapter 1.